The Harwick County Fairgrounds went completely still the moment the bugle sounded. 4 massive Belgian Malinois sat like carved stone at the front of the exhibition arena, their tactical vests gleaming under the flat October sky. Then the wind shifted, and the 4 most decorated search and rescue dogs in the state's history snapped their heads toward a young woman standing alone at the edge of the crowd, a woman in paint-stained jeans who had no business being there at all. What happened next would unravel a 2-year fraud and bring an entire county's law enforcement leadership to its knees. The Harwick County Search and Rescue Exposition was not a public event. Not really. The invitation list read like a roster of people who had never once been told no in their professional lives. State senators, the county sheriff, the regional director of Homeland Security, 2 federal judges, and a delegation from the National Search and Rescue Foundation, who had flown in from Washington specifically to present the unit with its annual commendation. Cameras from 3 local news affiliates were positioned behind a red velvet rope along the southern fence line. A small brass ensemble from the Harwick County Police Academy played quietly near the staging area. The whole thing had the careful, choreographed dignity of something that had been rehearsed 11 times. The 4 Belgian Malinois at the front of the arena were the centerpiece of the entire ceremony. These were not ordinary working dogs. They were Ember, Raider, Scout, and Flint, the canine backbone of the county's elite search and rescue division. Dogs so highly trained they could locate a living person buried under 12 feet of collapsed concrete, could track a scent trail 48 hours old across open water, could run a mile of pitch-dark forest at full speed, and return to their handler's side on a whispered command. The Foundation had ranked them the top active SAR unit east of the Mississippi 2 years running. They sat now in a perfect diagonal line beside their handlers, heads high, completely motionless, as though they had been briefed on the importance of the occasion and taken it personally. Sergeant Dylan Cross stood beside Ember, his left hand resting lightly on the top of her vest. Ember was the oldest of the 4. 6 years old, 62 pounds of muscle and instinct, with a scar that ran from her left ear to her jaw from a recovery operation in a collapsed parking garage 3 winters ago. She had pulled a 7-year-old boy out of that rubble. Cross had told that story at every fundraising dinner since. He told it well. He had learned to pause in the right places. At the very back of the civilian observation area, standing just inside the chain-link gate with a paper cup of bad coffee going cold in her hand, was a young woman who did not belong. Her name was Josephine Aldred, 29 years old, 5 feet 4 inches. She wore a canvas jacket with a rip along the left shoulder seam that had been repaired badly with electrical tape. Her dark hair was pulled into a knot at the back of her neck, with what appeared to be a rubber band from a bunch of grocery store broccoli. Her work boots were the kind that had been resoled at least twice. She had a faint dusting of dried plaster on her left cheekbone that she either hadn't noticed or hadn't cared to wipe off, and she smelled, faintly but unmistakably, of dog. The specific warm grass and fur smell of animals that are healthy and well-loved and live outdoors. A man in a pressed Carhartt jacket standing beside her glanced sideways at the coffee cup in her hand, then at the tape on her sleeve, then away with the particular studied blankness of someone who has decided not to engage. A woman in a county-issued lanyard stepped toward Josephine from the left, looked at her badge, a plain civilian guest pass, which anyone with 15 minutes and an internet connection could have printed, and stepped back without speaking. A younger officer near the gate, fresh out of the academy by the look of him, with a name tag that read Brierly, had already made 2 slow passes in her direction, his hand resting on his radio with the practiced ease of someone who had watched too many training videos about threat assessment. Officer Brierly made his 3rd pass and stopped. "You a press affiliate?" he asked. His tone was the specific flavor of polite that is actually very close to unfriendly. Josephine looked at him without blinking. "No, You on the invitation list? I got a civilian guest pass through the online portal. Briley looked at the pass, looked at the tape on her jacket sleeve, looked at the plaster on her face. The public viewing area is outside the south fence, he said. This section is for. I know what this section is for, Josephine said quietly. I just needed to see them. She was not looking at Briley when she said it. She was looking at the 4 dogs at the front of the arena. Briley followed her gaze, then looked back at her. He didn't push further. There was something in her expression that made him uncertain, a steadiness that didn't match the worn jacket and the bad coffee. But he didn't move away either. He stayed close, watching. The ceremony moved into its second phase. Sheriff Patricia Lowell stepped to the podium in full dress uniform, her silver hair severe under the brim of her hat. Lowell had been with the county for 27 years. She had a gift for this kind of speech, structured, respectful, designed to make the people behind her feel important without specifying why. These animals represent the absolute pinnacle of what dedicated training, institutional investment, and professional handler partnership can achieve, Lowell said, her voice carrying cleanly across the arena. They are the product of years of development, rigorous international vetting, and a procurement process that this department is deeply proud of. Polite applause moved through the crowd like a wave. Josephine Aldred's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She took a sip of her cold coffee and said nothing. At the front of the arena, the 4 Malinois remained absolutely still. Raider, the largest of them, a 70-pound male with a dark muzzle and copper-colored eyes, had his gaze fixed straight ahead, trained on nothing, trained on everything, the way working dogs learn to look when they are waiting for a command that hasn't come. Then the wind shifted. It moved from the south, a sharp October gust that swept low across the fairgrounds, lifted a few paper programs from the laps of seated dignitaries, and moved in a clean line from the back of the civilian observation area toward the front of the arena. It carried Josephine Aldred's scent directly into the exhibition space. The change in Ember was instantaneous and total. The old dog's nostrils flared once, twice, in rapid succession, and then every muscle in her compact body unlocked at once. The rigid posture dissolved, the tight ears swiveled forward, and a sound came out of her that Sergeant Cross had never once heard in 6 years of working beside her. It was not a bark. It was not the focused, clipped vocalization of a tracking dog on a hot trail. It was a high, desperate, sustained cry, the kind of sound that has no tactical application whatsoever, and comes entirely from some part of an animal that training doesn't reach. Cross grabbed her vest. Ember, sit. The command was automatic, firm, the product of thousands of repetitions. It did nothing. Ember stood up, all 4 feet on the ground, straining against the vest handle in Cross's grip, her entire body oriented toward the back of the civilian section like a compass needle finding north. Then Raider stood. The sound he made was lower, almost a groan, the sound of an animal recognizing something it had believed it would never encounter again. Raider, down. His handler, Officer Simone Vega, put both hands on his vest. He ignored her with a completeness that was almost offensive. Scout went next, then Flint. Within 30 seconds, all 4 of the most highly decorated search and rescue dogs in the region had abandoned every behavioral protocol they possessed. They were not attacking, they were not alerting, they were pulling toward the back of the crowd with a frantic, uncoordinated joy that looked completely undignified on animals that had been described, approximately 40 seconds ago, as the pinnacle of professional discipline. "Hold your dogs!" Sheriff Lowell's voice cracked across the arena, her composure fracturing at the edges. Cross planted his feet and leaned back with his full body weight. Ember, who weighed 62 pounds and was 6 years old and had a scar on her face, pulled him forward 3 full steps on the concrete before he managed to get his other hand on her collar. "I can't hold her," he said, which was a sentence he had genuinely never expected to say about this dog. I can't." The brass clip on Ember's vest handle gave first. She was loose before anyone had a chance to react. 62 pounds of Belgian Malinois, moving at full speed through the standing crowd. Weaving between legs and chairs with the unconscious precision of an animal that was not thinking about where she was going because she already knew. Raider went next, ripping the leash entirely out of Vega's grip. Scout and Flint followed within seconds, their handlers stumbling forward into each other in the chaos. "Loose dogs! Loose dogs!" Briley was already on his radio, one hand out in front of him, stepping toward the civilian crowd that had begun to scatter. "Everybody stay calm, please." Nobody stayed calm. The civilian observers broke in multiple directions. Folding chairs went over. A senator's aide dropped a leather portfolio and didn't stop to pick it up. The woman with the county lanyard was climbing the outside of the fence before she fully understood why. The camera operators from 2 of the 3 news affiliates took several steps back before professional instinct won out, and they kept rolling. Josephine Aldred did not move. She stood exactly where she had been standing, her paper cup still in her hand, and watched the 4 dogs coming toward her, and something crossed her face in the instant before they reached her. Not fear, not surprise, but something that looked like an exhale after a very long time of not breathing. Ember hit her first. All 62 pounds of her, front paws on Josephine's shoulders, nearly knocking her off her feet, face pressed so hard into the side of Josephine's neck that the young woman staggered a half step and laughed. A broken, overwhelmed sound that was not entirely different from a sob. Rata reached her a second later and went straight for her hands, pressing his face into her palms with a desperate insistence, making the low groaning sound that had nothing tactical about it at all. Scout and Flint were circling her in tight, ecstatic loops, their tails moving so hard their back ends swung from side to side like weather vanes in a crosswind. Officer Briley stopped with his baton half raised. He had been prepared to protect the civilian. The civilian did not appear to require protection. The civilian had her arms around 2 of the dogs, and her face pressed into the fur at the top of Ember's head, and was saying things too quietly to hear over the sound of 4 Malinois, making entirely undignified noises in front of county leadership and 3 camera crews. Sergeant Cross shoved through the remaining crowd and arrived at the edge of the space where Josephine was kneeling, all 4 dogs pressed against her from multiple directions. He stopped. His hand was still on the empty vest clip. He stared at his dog, at Ember, who was making sounds Cross had never once heard her make, and something about the absolute naturalness of the scene in front of him, the total absence of aggression or threat, made his hand drop to his side. "Ember," he said. It came out quiet instead of commanding. Ember did not look at him. Sheriff Lowell pushed through the ring of stunned officers, her hat slightly off-center, her composure reassembled with visible effort. She looked at the young woman on the ground, surrounded by her department's 4 most decorated assets, and then she looked at the woman's jacket sleeve with the electrical tape, and then she looked at Sergeant Cross. "Who is she?" Lowell said. Cross shook his head slowly. He didn't. No. Josephine Aldred looked up from the fur she had her face buried in. Her eyes were wet. She wasn't embarrassed about it. "They just know my scent," she said. "I'm sorry for the disruption. I didn't expect." She stopped, pressing her lips together. "I didn't know if they would remember. Step away from the animals, please," Lowell said. And her voice had the forced flatness of a person managing a situation they do not understand. Josephine started to stand. All 4 dogs immediately pressed closer. Raider planted himself directly between her and the sheriff, with a calm, calibre certainty that had nothing about it and everything protective. Lowell's eyes narrowed. She had worked with dogs her entire career. She had never seen 4 trained working animals collectively decide that a stranger was theirs to guard, that a stranger— "I think," Cross said quietly, not looking away from Ember, "we need to hear what she has to say." They took her to the administration office, which was the nearest enclosed space with chairs and a door that closed. The dogs refused to go to their handlers. When Vega tried to clip a lead to Raider's collar, he sat down with the immovable solidity of a very large object that has decided to be stationary, and simply waited until Josephine tapped her thigh and said, "Come on," in a voice that had the automatic ease of a habit. All 4 dogs fell into a loose formation around her and walked into the administration office as if they had done it 1,000 times, which, Josephine would explain shortly, they had. Sheriff Lowell sat across the table. Sergeant Cross stood to the left of the door. Josephine sat in a plastic chair with Ember across her feet and Raider's head on her knee. The recording from Lowell's body camera was running. Lowell had made sure of that. "Start at the beginning," Lowell said. Josephine set the paper coffee cup down on the table. She laced her fingers together and looked at them for a moment. "My name is Josephine Aldred," she said. "For 6 years, I ran a search and rescue training operation of a property in Sutter's Creek, about 40 miles east of here. I called it Ridgeline Working Dogs. I didn't have investors. I didn't have a board of directors. I had 11 acres of mixed terrain, a 3-room house I was renting month to month, and whatever I could make from contract training work, and 1 private donor who believed in what I was doing." Cross looked at Lowell. Lowell's face was unreadable. "I started Ridgeline when I was 22, Josephine continued. "I had trained under 2 SAR programs in Oregon and learned under a woman named Dr. Carol Fisk, who spent 40 years developing what she called natural environment imprinting. Basically the idea that a dog trained in synthetic, controlled conditions will always perform worse in a real disaster scenario than a dog trained in genuine unpredictability from the beginning. You put the dog in real forests, real collapsed structures, real weather. You don't simulate, you let the environment teach. The dogs I trained at Ridgeline, every single one of them, were rescue dogs. Dogs pulled from shelters, from fighting operations, from neglect cases. Animals that the system had already decided weren't worth the effort." Ember shifted on Josephine's feet and resettled herself with a contented sigh. "Those 4, Josephine said, nodding once toward the dogs. "I called them something different than what you call them now. Ember I found at an animal control facility in Rowan County. She was listed as too fear-aggressive for rehoming. She was 14 months old and weighed 31 pounds. That's her at 6 years and 62 pounds. She paused. I named her June." The room was quiet except for the distant sound of the brass ensemble outside, which had apparently resumed playing, either because nobody had told them to stop, or because formality was the only thing anyone out there knew how to do. "Raider. I called him Tank. Pulled from a dog-fighting bust in Clearfield 2 years before you got him. He had a broken toe on his right front paw that had healed without treatment. You can feel the knot on it if you run your hand up the inside of his leg." She looked at Cross. "Your vet attributed it to a training injury." Cross looked at Vega. Vega looked at the floor. "Scout I found on the side of Route 18 in February. 3 years ago, he'd been thrown from a vehicle. Both his back legs were in bad enough shape that the emergency vet I took him to. I did not should consider euthanasia. I did not. He was in my rehabilitation program for 7 months before he took his first full off-leash run in the pasture. Flint." She stopped, and for the first time her voice did something involuntary. She pressed her lips together and waited a second before continuing. "Flint I raised from 8 weeks old. He was the only survivor of a litter abandoned in a storage unit in January. He used to sleep on my feet every night for 2 years. Sheriff Lowell had stopped breathing with the particular stillness of a person who is processing something very large. In March of last year, Josephine said, a man came to Ridgeline in an unmarked state vehicle. He identified himself as Regional Coordinator Dennis Haverford from the state's Emergency Management Credentialing Division. He had documentation, licensing boards, a state inspector, 2 uniformed officers. He told me that Ridgeline had been operating outside of required commercial kennel certification, that my SAR training contract work legally constituted a commercial training enterprise, that I had been in violation of state code for over 3 years, and that all 11 animals currently on property were subject to immediate impoundment as potentially dangerous animals operating outside licensed oversight. Llewell's hand had moved to the edge of the table. "I had a lawyer on the phone within an hour," Josephine said. "She told me the citations were real, but that the enforcement process being used was accelerated in a way that was highly irregular. She said she could fight it. She said it would take months." In the meantime, Haverford's people loaded all 11 dogs into a county transport vehicle and drove away. Her voice dropped. "They let me say goodbye. I'll give them that. They let me go to each of them before they closed the transport." "Flint," he pressed his nose through the grate. I held his face. She blinked. "Then they drove away." Cross had his hand over his mouth. He was looking at Raider. "I spent 14 months trying to find out what happened to them," Josephine continued. "Haverford's division, when I called, had no record of any impoundment from Ridgeline. The animals were not at any state facility. My lawyer filed 4 separate FOIA requests. She got heavily redacted documents and 1 letter citing an ongoing procurement investigation that she was not permitted to inquire further about. Josephine opened the canvas jacket and removed from an inside pocket a single folded document. She placed it on the table. 3 weeks ago, I was watching the news. They ran a preview segment for today's exposition. They showed the 4 dogs working a training simulation, and I watched Ember run a concrete debris field. Her voice steadied completely. "She has a specific way of moving through debris. She lifts her back left paw fractionally higher than the others because of an old ligament scar from when she was 2. I watched her do it on my television, and I knew." Sheriff Lowell reached across the table and turned the document to face her. It was a veterinary intake record from a Rowan County animal control facility, dated 4.5 years ago, with a photograph attached. A thin, terrified young Malinois female with a band tag around her neck, and a notation that read fear-reactive, not suitable for placement, recommend evaluation for euthanasia. The dog in the photograph and the dog currently sprawled across Josephine Aldred's feet were, without any ambiguity whatsoever, the same animal. Lowell looked at Cross. Cross looked at Josephine. "I didn't come here to make a scene," Josephine said. "I just needed to know they were okay. I thought, if I could just see them, I could close it. I could go back to Sutter's Creek and figure out what comes next." She looked down at Ember, who had rolled slightly to press her spine against Josephine's ankle. "I didn't know if they'd remember me. It's been over a year." Cross crouched down beside Raider, who permitted this with a tolerant dignity. He ran his right hand slowly up the inside of the dog's left foreleg until his fingers found the knot of bone where the old break had healed crooked. He sat back on his heels and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "The procurement paperwork for these dogs," he said finally, "came from a private organization called North State Working K9 Partners. They had certification documentation, European pedigree records, international transport manifests." He stopped. "I never questioned it." "I know," Josephine said, without any accusation in it. Sheriff Lowell picked up the veterinary record, then set it down, then picked it up again. She was doing the math. The county had paid North State Working K9 Partners $380,000 for 4 dogs with international pedigrees and classified military training backgrounds. Those dogs were currently expressing their classified military training backgrounds by competing for the most comfortable position against a 29-year-old woman in a repaired canvas jacket. "Who is Dennis Haverford?" Lowell asked, her voice very quiet. Josephine shook her head. "That's what I couldn't find out. The state has no record of that name in the Emergency Management Division. Not current, not former. My lawyer thinks Haverford was a fabricated identity." Lowell stood up. She picked up the veterinary record and 3 other documents Josephine had produced from her jacket. Intake photos, microchip registration in her name, training logs with dates, and she walked to the door and opened it. "Cross," she said. "Get me the original North State procurement file, all of it, tonight." She paused in the doorway and turned back to look at the scene in the room. The young woman in the worn jacket, the 4 decorated working dogs arranged around her in a loose, unworried configuration that looked nothing like discipline and everything like belonging. And someone bring this woman a real cup of coffee. What followed over the next 72 hours was not the kind of thing that goes smoothly or quietly. The county attorney's office got involved on the first evening. The state attorney general's office got involved by noon of the second day. By the third morning, a federal investigator named Castlewood arrived from the Regional Fraud and Corruption Unit, set up in the conference room next to Lowell's office, and began working through the North State procurement file, with has done this many times before someone, milititical patience. North State Working K9 Partners dissolved as a corporate entity 13 days after the sale of the 4 dogs to Harwick County. Its registered agent was a name that led to a mailing address in Nevada, that led to a defunct LLC, that led, after considerable effort, to a man named Bernard Quill, who had spent 8 years as a supervisor in the county's facilities management division, before leaving in a retirement that had been, the investigators quickly determined, somewhat accelerated by a quiet ethics inquiry that had never been made public. Quill had since relocated to Scottsdale, Arizona, where he had purchased a substantial property on a golf course approximately 11 months after the North State payment had cleared. Bernard Quill was arrested at that property on a Tuesday morning, still in a bathrobe, with a cup of coffee in his hand. He was charged with wire fraud, identity fraud, civil theft of 11 animals, and misuse of a government credential. The 11th count was the one that his lawyer objected to most vigorously, on the grounds that dogs were property, which is a legal argument that lands differently when the dogs in question had been watching the arrest coverage from a county K9 facility and could not have cared less. All 11 dogs were located. 6 had been sold to county law enforcement agencies in 3 states under the same fabricated international provenance that had been used with Harwick County. 4 were at a private security contractor's training facility in western Pennsylvania. 1, a male Malinois that Josephine had named Copper, recovered from a hoarding case in her 3rd year of operation, was found at a private residence in rural Ohio, being used as a guard dog by a family who had bought him from a man answering to the name Haverford through a now-deleted online classified listing. Copper was healthy. He had developed an attachment to the family's youngest child, a situation that the investigators' report described as emotionally complex, and that Josephine described, when told about it, as exactly like him, honestly. All 11 animals were legally returned to Josephine Aldred as their documented owner of record. All 11 were confirmed healthy. All 11 retained the behavioral training they had received at Ridgeline Working Dogs, which the federal investigators' consulting veterinarian described in her official report as among the most sophisticated SAR imprinting work I have seen in 20 years of evaluating working animals. Cross drove out to Sutter's Creek on the Thursday after the arrests. He found Josephine in the pasture behind the property she had rented, sitting in the tall grass with Ember in her lap, and Raider pressed against her side, and Scout and Flint running large, unserious circles in the field around her. She had a thermos of coffee. She offered him some. He sat down in the grass and accepted it. "They're going to want to talk to you," he said, "about a formal role. Consulting or—" "I know," Josephine said. "The foundation is also interested. After everything came out, they—" "I know," she said again. They sat quietly for a minute. Ember was asleep in her lap. It was a cold afternoon, but the sun was out and sideways through the grass and catching the copper in Raider's fur. "I owe you an apology," Cross said. "You didn't know. I should have asked better questions." Josephine considered this. "Probably," she said, "but you took care of them. That's not nothing." Cross looked at Ember, at the scar along her jaw, at the way she slept in this woman's lap with an absolute trustingness that she had never quite managed with him, even after 2 years. He thought about what it had cost this dog to arrive at that kind of trust once, to have it taken away, and to have to locate it again. He thought about what it said that she had. She saved a 7-year-old in a parking garage collapse, he said. I want you to know that. She went into a void space that none of us could fit through. She was in there alone for 11 minutes. Josephine's hand tightened in the fur at the back of Ember's neck. The dog didn't stir. I know, Josephine said quietly. I heard about it. She looked out across the field where Scout was now attempting to convince Flint to chase him, with the particular theatrical desperation of an animal who wants to play and is not getting the enthusiasm he deserves. I heard about all of it. I kept clippings. Cross handed back the thermos. Will you come back? To the unit? Josephine looked at the 4 dogs. June, Tank, the one with the knot in his foreleg. Scout with the back legs that a vet had said were probably not worth fixing. Flint, who used to sleep on her feet, spread across the November grass like they had never been anywhere else. Ridgeline isn't just for K9 work, she said. I want to keep doing rehab, the broken ones, the written-off ones. That's the part I'm not willing to give up. She paused. But if there's a way to structure it so the county has access to the training pipeline, a real one built the right way from the start, then yeah. She looked at him. I'll come back. 6 months later, on a Thursday morning in early spring, a weathered wooden sign went up at the end of a gravel drive 11 miles east of the Harwick County Fairgrounds. It read Ridgeline Working Dogs, Sutter's Creek. Below that, in smaller letters, in partnership with the Harwick County Search and Rescue Division, the new facility had 12 acres, a proper training building, a rehabilitation wing, and a county budget line that Josephine had negotiated with the same calm directness she apparently brought to everything. Bernard Quill was convicted on 9 of 11 counts and sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, with full restitution ordered. And every morning at the Ridgeline facility, a young woman in a canvas jacket, the same jacket, repaired again now with actual thread, would walk out to the training field, and 4 Belgian Malinois would come off their downstays and sprint toward her the way dogs sprint toward someone they chose, long before anyone handed them a vest or a title or a reason to be called heroes. They already knew why. They had always known